So that's my cue to get started. I want to welcome everybody to this afternoon's information session. We're going to be talking about community grants at the Winnipeg Foundation. I do want to note that this session is being recorded and it will be posted on our website for those who weren't able to attend in person, or for anybody who wants to review the material again. This will be going on our website. One thing we've learned about Zoom is that when the chat function is active, that activity also gets picked up in the recording, so just be mindful of that. Before we begin, to acknowledge that today I am on Treaty 1, as many of you are. We're not gathered together in person, but I still do want to acknowledge that we're gathered, or that we are all on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Ojibwe, the Dakota, and the Dene people, as well as the homeland of the Métis Nation. And I always like to make that acknowledgement. And it's just to note that it's part of the Winnipeg Foundation's journey towards reconciliation, and it's something that we wanted to do. And so, although we're not gathered, I'd invite you all just to take a moment where you are to acknowledge the land. So on the next slide, I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of what the presentation is going to be covering today. I'll be telling you a little bit about how the Winnipeg Foundation works, how we've responded to and how we've been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, as I know many of you have been as well, and then give you some information about our one-time community grants program, which will be the main focus of today's presentation, specifically the intake that we have with applications due at the end of this month. I'll be getting into eligibility later in the presentation, but for those who are maybe new to the Winnipeg Foundation, I do want to note that to be eligible to apply for a grant, your organization must have a registered charity number, and your project must primarily serve the citizens of Winnipeg. So those are two key criteria for our community grants program. After I get through the bulk of the presentation, there'll be an opportunity for some Q&A. We'd also invite you to use the chat feature if you have any questions, and we'll try to respond to those in real time. After the Q&A, for those who are not familiar with our online application system, we'll be hanging out for a few more minutes to give a little bit more detailed information about how to submit your application using our online application. So for new applicants, I'd encourage you to stick around for that part. But those of you who are familiar with grants at the Winnipeg Foundation, you can feel free to log off after the Q&A. So a little bit of an update about the foundation and where we're at. What you see on your screen is a photo from a staff meeting when all staff were working remotely, working from home fairly early on in the pandemic. Now we've moved to a cohort system where half of the staff will be in the office at any given time. You might be able to tell I'm in my office today, while some of my colleagues are working remotely from home. That's how things are going to be for the foreseeable future. In addition, our offices are currently closed to visitors, and all our meetings with donors and grantees are happening on the phone or online platforms like Zoom. And our staff, one of our favorite things is to attend community events hosted by all of you, but we'll only be attending events intermittently, and only those where social distancing protocols have been established. But whether we're in the office or we're at home, we're always accessible. Probably email is the best way to reach us, but certainly you can call our main line. If you're not sure who at the foundation you'd like to talk to, you can always use our grants@winnipegfoundation.org email address, and we'll direct your inquiry to the right person. So on the next slide, I'm going to introduce you to our grants team. Normally, we would do this if we were all in a room together. I'd invite team members to stand up. I'm Megan Tate. I'm Director of Community Grants here at the Winnipeg Foundation. On the screen, you'll see Kayla, Anna, and Andrea. They're part of our admin team. So Anna is the person responsible for community grants. So you might receive correspondence from her if you've applied and received a community grant in the past. Kayla works with a lot of our donor advised funds. And so if you're lucky enough to receive a donor advised grant, you might have heard from Kayla. And Andrea does a lot of the administration for many of our special granting programs. So that's the first part of our team. And then on the next slide, I'll introduce you to the rest of the group. Nana Thanius is one of our community grants associates. The cause that she works in primarily is children, youth, and families. Brigitte DePape is a grant specialist. Brigitte administers many of our special granting programs like Nourishing Potential and Literacy for Life. Noah Ehrenberg is our tech support for this afternoon, and he's the Community Grants Associate responsible for the portfolio Health, Wellness, and Recreation. Aaliyah is our youth engagement coordinator. Like many things, youth and philanthropy is going to look different this year. So if you've been lucky enough to host a group of high school students for a youth and philanthropy site visit, know that we're still committed to offering the program, but it might look a little bit different in these times. Carrie is also a grants associate. She has two portfolios, environment and animal welfare, as well as literacy, education, and employment. And finally, Joanna Turner is our grants associate with the portfolio of arts, culture, and heritage. So that is our community grants team. So on the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about the Winnipeg Foundation. Many of you would be familiar with us and our work in community, but we always like to share that we're a community foundation. We're one of over 191 community foundations from coast to coast to coast, but we're really proud to say that we are Canada's first community foundation, established in 1921, which means that we will be celebrating our 100th anniversary next year. Some other things that are happening for us next year, you may have heard that our long-serving CEO, Rick Frost, is going to be retiring in 2021. This process is being guided by our board of directors who have strong community focus and also want to know that we will continue to have strong leadership from our management team to help guide the foundation through this transition. So a little bit about our donors, and it's really donors at the Winnipeg Foundation that make us a community foundation. So I'll just ask Noah to click us, there we go. So the Winnipeg Foundation is a collection of over 4,000 permanent endowment funds, each with its own trust conditions established by donors from all walks of life. Those funds, those gifts are pooled and invested. And each year we grant a portion of the interest earned, depending on our spending policy. So in 2020, our spending rate was 5%, but due to some recent volatility in the financial markets, this may change slightly for 2021, but our goal is always to ensure as much consistency as possible for the charitable sector. And I think it's really important to note our donors are always incredibly important, but this year, during the time of COVID, our donors really stepped up and were really critical to our ability to respond to the community need over the past 6 months. We had donors contribute to our COVID-19 Community Response Fund. Many of our donor advisors chose to allocate their grant dollars towards some emergency funding that was needed in our community, while still others were part of our stabilization grants program. So on the next slide, a little bit about grants at the Winnipeg Foundation. So in 2019, we distributed $57.5 million to over 900 charities. And I think it's important to understand how the grant dollars go out. Most people would be familiar with the Winnipeg Foundation's responsive grant making. That's the grants that we do in response to applications from community organizations like yours. But that doesn't tell the whole picture. So the slide that you see up there today shows a little bit of a breakdown of how our grants are allocated. This will vary, depending on the year and depending on the organization's grant making or on the foundation's grant making activity. But just to note that typically about a third of our total grant making is awarded as responsive grants. And then it's further broken down with about a quarter of our grant making activity being dispersed from agency and designated funds. So agency funds are established by community organizations like yours, and the annual income goes back to those organizations to be used at their discretion, while designated funds are established by donors who've identified which organization they want to receive the annual income from their fund. Probably one of our fastest growing fund types is donor advised funds. About 20% of our grant making activity happens from these types of funds, and that's where donors are actively involved in the decision making around their grant making each year. There's a couple of ways that donors can make grants. Some come to the foundation already knowing where they want their grant dollars to go each year. We do have a few donors that independently of the foundation put out calls for proposals. When we're part of that process, certainly we include that information on our website, but some choose to do it independently. But increasingly, some donors are choosing to be part of our community grants programs. So when you submit an application to the Winnipeg Foundation through a community grant application, we'll often share that information with donors who we think might be interested in projects like yours and invite them to be part of that grant making. So that's another way that we engage donor advisors. Managed funds are similar to agency and designated funds. The only difference is the Winnipeg Foundation actually doesn't own those assets for managed funds, but those go back to the recipient agencies. You'll see that about 7% of our grant making it goes to Manitoba Community Foundations. So Manitoba has more community foundations than any other province in Canada. There's 55 of us all together. And so the Winnipeg Foundation does administer the funds from some of the other community foundations in Manitoba. And so that shows the disbursements back to those communities for their own grant making activity. About 6% of our grant making is for leadership projects. Those are proactive initiatives that the board of directors undertakes. Some examples of that is the Belvedere in St. Boniface. Over the summer, we recently installed some public art at the Forks that was created by local Indigenous artists. So those are some examples of the leadership projects that we do. And finally, 5% of our grant making goes out in the form of scholarships. Those are funds established by donors who wish to support students with their education. So that's grants at the Winnipeg Foundation in a nutshell. On the next slide, I'm going to show you a little bit about what we did during COVID-19. So one of the very first things that we did was provide emergency support to those community organizations that were meeting the needs of our most vulnerable community members. So one of the last things I did while I was walking out of the office on March 16th was make sure that we had grants out the door to organizations like Winnipeg Harvest and Main Street Project. We've also provided grants to family resource centers and other organizations, again, meeting the most immediate needs of vulnerable community members, all together through our own COVID-19 Community Response Fund, as well as funds that were made available to us by the federal government in partnership with Community Foundations of Canada and our friends at United Way. We were able to distribute $2.6 million in emergency support to local community organizations. And then many of our donor advisors increased that support even more. Many of you might be familiar with our stabilization grants program. We launched that in May, and that was an opportunity for organizations to apply to have their short and medium term needs addressed. In total, we granted $8.9 million to 279 local organizations. That was the biggest intake we've ever had in the history of the foundation, but was certainly needed by our community. And finally, we are starting to think about recovery, thinking more about the medium and longer term needs of organizations and the charitable sector. The first phase of that starts with our September 30th intake. Organizations may apply for just regular projects and programming that you have on the go, but we're also open to applications that continue to be related to the impact of COVID-19. We've reduced barriers to the application by removing some of the eligibility criteria for this program, which I'll get into in a bit more detail. But we also recognize that for many organizations, you're not at the recovery stage yet. And this is going to be something that is going to be with us for a while, that you may have additional needs for simply stabilization or figuring out how your organization can work in the world the way that it is now. So we're really watching and listening to what's happening in the community and trying to make sure that our response continues to be as flexible as possible. So in terms of what COVID-19 means for the Winnipeg Foundation, granting will continue. Like every organization who's been facing this, we've tried to be nimble, resourceful, and creative. It's certainly disrupted our regular grant making, but it's allowed us to respond quickly to community need. It's also been a time of incredible learning for our staff. It's given us the opportunity to try out different approaches to grant making, new processes, which we hope that we'll be able to take those learnings as we continue as grant makers. The foundation will continue to make grants and support a wide range of charitable work. We're lucky that our grant making budget in 2020 was augmented by additional donor support and federal funding. However, that we do anticipate in 2021, our responsive granting budget will be fairly consistent with years prior to 2020. The past 6 months have seen several changes to our responsive grant programs, including timelines. We had planned to relaunch our multi-year grant program this year, but had to put it on hold to adapt to respond to some more immediate needs in our community. So responsive grants, as I mentioned, that is what we call grants that are awarded in response to applications from community organizations like yours. This information presents our usual calendar of grant intakes, but it's important to note that this is subject to change depending on the needs of community. I think if we've learned anything over the last 6 months, it's that things are constantly changing, and that the Winnipeg Foundation, like so many of your organizations, are having to change and adapt to the circumstances in our community. So we describe ourselves as a project funder. So through our responsive grants, we're dedicated to supporting a broad range of projects on a time-limited basis, typically 1 year or less. We know that organizations need stable, ongoing operating support, which is increasingly rare. And our project funder model simply can't meet this need, but the trade-off is that we're able to be flexible, support innovative ideas, and respond to changing community ideas. And I think our response to COVID-19 is a good example of the flexibility that being a project funder allows us. The process of applying for a grant is always competitive. Demand always exceeds the funding that's available. And so later in this presentation, we'll be sharing some tips for what we look for in a successful proposal. So I'm going to give you a brief overview of some of our special program grants. I'm not going to get into a lot of detail, but you can see the list there on the screen. Like all foundation grant programs, only registered charities are eligible to apply for these special program grants. And projects must primarily benefit the citizens of Winnipeg, with the exception of the Literacy for Life Grants program, which does have a province-wide mandate. Each granting program has its own timelines and criteria, and we have a page dedicated to each grant program on our website, so be sure to check that for more details. You can always sign up for our grant e-news to be informed of any changes to grant programs or reminders of upcoming intake dates. And also from time to time, we have special calls for proposals, like we did a few years ago for a special standalone reconciliation grants program. Today we'll be talking about community grants in more detail. And so on the next slide, you'll see that we've got two types of community grants. I'll just let Noah catch up to me. There we go. Oh, look at that cutie. So we've got two types of community grants. One-time community grants, which is for short-term projects, typically 1 year or less. And organizations can apply for up to $100,000 for a one-time community grant. Last year, we had intended to offer the Resilient Community Grants, which is the new name for our multi-year funding. It's important to note that normally we accept only one community grant request per calendar year. However, this September, we are waiving that rule for community organizations. So even if you've applied and received a grant this past January, you're still able to apply this September, even if your previous request was approved and you still have outstanding reports. Resilient community grants, which we put on pause for 2020. We had originally intended to offer these in 2020, 2021, and 2022. But instead in the spring, we released our stabilization grants. We really hope to be able to relaunch this program in 2021. We expect to make an announcement in January, but as I've already mentioned, we really need to stay as flexible as possible to respond to whatever the most immediate needs are in our community. And so we'll certainly be having conversations with our grants committee about what our grants intake calendar looks like for 2021. So on the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about our grant making priorities. Our grant making priorities are arranged around our 5 causes. Within each cause, we've got a number of grant making priorities. These were developed in consultation with community. We used our Vital Signs program to inform this work. And it's how we hope to measure our effectiveness. Well, it's how we had hoped to measure our effectiveness as a grant maker, but I think COVID-19 had a few things to say about that. However, we will still be looking at the grant making priorities, and that will be a question that you'll see as part of your one-time community grant application when you go to submit at the end of September. So there are 16 priorities that fall under the 5 cause areas. A detailed list of those can be found on our website. We also have 2 overarching grant making priorities that are relevant to all of the causes. And one of those is capacity building. For a number of years, the Winnipeg Foundation has looked for ways to invest in building the capacity of charitable organizations, as well as reconciliation. Certainly a conversation in our community that continues is reconciliation. And so that's an overriding grant making priority for the foundation. So I'm gonna get into things and talk a little bit more about one-time community grants. So the first thing to note is for this September, we are waiving a couple of our typical eligibility requirements, which means that virtually all organizations will be eligible to apply for a one-time community grant. Because of that, we do anticipate that we will receive a lot of applications and that it will be quite a competitive grants round. So on the next slide, you'll see just some examples of the types of projects that can be supported by a one-time community grant. And so that's everything from capital to renovations to short-term operating support, which I can get into in a little bit more detail. So a note about the name, one-time community grants. That was intended to note that these are grants to support projects for a definite period of time, and it was just a way to help us differentiate from our multi-year community grants. However, we do note that a project could be ongoing and you could apply for funds to run it for 12 months, for example. It's also possible to receive a one-time grant in subsequent years for the same project, but just know that you can only get funding approved 1 year at a time. Examples of when we might do this is a project that shows promise but needs an extra year or 2 to get some solid footing under it. Any subsequent grants would be based on the reporting of previous years, but again, to note that you can apply for the same project over the course of several years through our one-time community grants program. So some of the types of projects we supported, as I mentioned, everything from capital to renovations, conferences and events, so a conference that you might be hosting, things like performances, festivals, anniversary celebrations, special exhibitions, are all the types of events we could support. Equipment and infrastructure, that can be everything from computers and servers, furniture, websites, those kinds of things. When you are applying for capital renovations or for equipment, we do ask you to include quotes to help you build the budget for those projects. We also, again, on a time-limited basis, can provide grants for program operating. So those are the costs of a specific program, typically a pilot program or a demonstration project, but not necessarily. Eligible costs can include staffing and other program costs. We also will consider including between 10 and 15% of administrative costs for any program. Some examples of reports and planning include strategic plans, fundraising strategies, evaluations, business plans, capital campaign, that kind of thing. We also can support capital campaigns through this stream. It's important to note that we do also have an intake specifically for major capital grants for larger capital campaign projects. Under very special circumstances, the foundation will consider grant requests for bridge funding or short-term operating support, but we'd invite you to have that conversation with a member of our grants team to discuss the circumstances for your organization before putting forward an application. And finally, as I mentioned, we continue to be interested in organizational development and capacity building. And so that can be anything, including board development, strat planning, evaluations, those kinds of things. There's a couple of things that we're not able to support. First, we cannot make grants to individuals. We also can't provide grants for projects costs incurred prior to the grants committee makes their decision. So for grants submitted in September, we do anticipate that the grants committee will be making those decisions at the end of January, early February. We also don't support annual fundraising campaigns or events. We don't provide grants to pay down mortgages or reduce deficits. We don't fund political activities. We don't fund exclusively religious activities, and so we know that there's many faith-based organizations that do great work in our community, and certainly we support their community work. We just wouldn't support the directly religious activities of those organizations. And we also don't fund other grant-making programs. So there are some charities that have grant programs, and we don't support those. So some of the things that we look for in a grant application. So first up is the eligibility for a community grant at the Winnipeg Foundation, which is on the next slide. As I mentioned, only organizations with a registered charity number are eligible to apply. Projects must primarily benefit the people of Winnipeg. And normally what we look for is satisfactory reporting on previous community grants. However, we are waiving this for September 2020. We know that many organizations had their programs and projects delayed or stalled because of COVID-19. And so we are really understanding that those are the circumstances for your organization. So for this intake, that is not going to be a requirement for you to submit an application. I should also note here that for organizations who received a COVID stabilization grant, that also does not affect your opportunity to apply for a community grant this September. Finally, to note, in the past, groups with an outstanding major capital grant were also not eligible to apply for a one-time community grant, and we've also waived that as well. And finally, to note that grants are not made retroactively. So a little bit about our assessment criteria. So there's a number of things that we look at when we're reviewing grant applications. So our grants committee looks at both the organization putting forward the proposal as well as the project being proposed. So when it comes to organizations, some of the things that we look at is your grant history, which is always a factor in our decision making. So we want to know about, how many grants you've received from the Winnipeg Foundation, how those programs went, that kind of thing. We also look at an organization's capacity to be able to contribute to a project, and that can be either cash or in kind. It is something that we consider. This is a holdover from when we always run this presentation, and so often our grants associates will do a site visit and go out and meet your organization where you're at. It's our chance to get to know your organization or your project and collect information for our grants committee. It's always important to note that a site visit does not mean that your grant application will be approved. But while we're working in a more limited capacity, our staff won't be doing in-person site visits, but certainly you can expect to get a phone call or some other communication if any of our staff have questions. So some of the things that we look for in a project is alignment with the Winnipeg Foundation's grant-making priorities. Again, a detailed list of those priorities can be found on our website. We're also looking at the congruency of the project with your organization's mission. And so if a project represents a shift away from your organization's mission, we'd be looking for a little bit more information about why your board has decided to go in this direction, or how you feel the project will advance your organization's mission. We're looking for clear goals and activities, as well as the overall viability of the project. Is it a realistic plan that you have presented? We're looking at the benefit to the community, which might include the depth of the project. Will it impact individuals, families, whole neighborhoods? We also look at the needs of the population served, and so some information that you might want to include a proposal is some information about the stats of the population you're hoping to serve, some community surveys or evidence of a needs assessment, again, depending on the type of project that you're proposing. And another thing that we look at is, are there other funders who are willing to be part of and to fund that project? The next slide goes through a few other things that we look at when we're assessing a project. So one of those is the qualifications of the staff who will be delivering the program. So for example, if you're proposing to offer a counseling program, are the people who are going to be delivering that service qualified to deliver counseling services? That kind of thing. We want to know if, again, where appropriate or relevant to your project, if you've consulted with other organizations or individuals, or if you're collaborating with other groups in your community. We're looking for a realistic budget. We also want to know about the viability of your project if the full amount that you've requested isn't granted. As I've mentioned, we always receive far more requests than we have funds available, and sometimes our grants committee might choose to approve less than what was requested. In those instances, we'd want to know that the project was still able to go forward with that lesser amount. From time to time, we also do reach out to community experts or other funders to get their perspectives on your organization or the project itself. Because we're a 360-degree grant maker, we can't necessarily be an expert in everything, and so that's where we would reach out to community for their feedback. Some other considerations, especially for large projects, are there other funders who are going to be part of that project? If you're working with diverse populations, have you demonstrated cultural competency in working with diverse cultures? And finally, for construction and renovation projects, has accessibility been considered as part of the design of those projects? We also ask that organizations adhere to the effective practices followed by their sector. We want to know if a project's impact on the environment is considered. So an example of that is if you have a food program, are you using disposable dishes or reusable, recyclable materials? And finally, grants are not made for projects that are the primary responsibility of municipal, provincial, or federal governments. And sometimes people ask what we mean about that. And so I think a great example is, support for hospitals. So we would not fund a nursing staff position, for example, but we might approve a grant for a hospital to do enhancements to their children's play area. So that's kind of the distinction that we would make for those types of projects or those types of organizations. So I'm going to talk a little bit about collaborations. And over the years, we've put a little bit of thought and work into our definition around collaboration. So the definition hasn't really changed, but we just wanted to provide a little bit more guidance by what we mean for a collaboration. And why this is important is because through our grants, organizations can apply in a usual year, once per calendar year, for their own project, but they may also apply for a collaborative project in the same calendar year. So we just wanted to be as clear as possible in what we mean about a collaboration. And so we define a collaboration as 2 or more registered charity or a registered charity and a nonprofit organization jointly planning and implementing a project. For the purposes of a collaboration and a grant application, for-profit businesses are not considered collaborative partners. Certainly you may collaborate with a business on a project, but that wouldn't meet our definition of a collaboration. And I think the part that's really important here is the jointly planning and implementing a project, that we would expect that a collaboration that both partners were fully active in all phases of the project. We also would expect that all collaborative partners would work towards a common goal to increase organizational or program efficiency, effectiveness, or to tackle a community issue. So some examples of collaborations might include administrative alliances, organizational mergers, and projects that combine the strengths and perspectives to tackle the root cause of pressing issues. So some of the features of a collaboration, and this is how we'll assess the strength of a collaboration. So if you are submitting an application for a collaborative project, you must clearly identify in the application that it's a collaborative project and who each of the partners are. We want to know what the community issue is that the collaboration will address. And then we really want to know what the involvement of each partner is and their previous relevant work, as well as things like defined roles and responsibilities for each partner. And each partner organization must provide a signed letter of agreement that clearly outlines their specific roles and responsibilities. And that's just from our perspective to ensure that it truly meets what we're looking for in a collaborative project. If you are a coalition or a network, we'd encourage you to discuss your proposal with a member of our staff before submitting a proposal, to help walk you through that. Some general information about applying for a grant at the Winnipeg Foundation. So our applications close promptly at 4:30 p.m. on the application due date. If you have started an application, but you haven't been able to submit it by 4:30, unfortunately, that in-progress application will be lost. And I think part of the reason that we have this rule is that if you run into issues after 4:30 p.m., our staff won't be around to help you. So we'd really encourage you to apply during office hours, which will allow you to access our staff for help. It's important to note that you can apply for a community grant and a special program grant in the same calendar year, but it must be for a different project. The Winnipeg Foundation reviews all of our applications based on their merit, and we don't discriminate on the basis of actual or perceived group characteristics as outlined in the Manitoba Human Rights Code. Also, organizations that are applying for a grant to the Winnipeg Foundation must also adhere to the Manitoba Human Rights Code. And again, as I said earlier, applying for a community grant is a competitive process, and organizations are not guaranteed funding each year. And as always, if you have any questions about the foundation or application process, or you want to discuss a project before you submit an application, our grant staff is always happy to chat with you. Again, might be best to reach out by email to start. So I'm going to turn things over to invite people. If you have any general questions, I'm happy to answer those. If you have more specific questions that are unique to the needs of your organization, I'd ask you to get in touch with one of our grants associates after the presentation. But if you have some general questions, I'm happy to answer those. And I think the easiest way is if you post your question using the chat feature, and my colleague Carrie is going to read them out to me, and hopefully I will be able to answer them.
Oh, there's a question about how to reach a representative to discuss an application.
Oh, that's a great question. So again, probably while we're working partly in the office and partly remotely, the best way to get in touch with us is email. And if you go to our website, we have a staff contact page. You'll see each staff member's photo as well as a link to their email address. So that's the best way to get a hold of us.
Okay, there's somebody who's asking if we can release the total amount available for granting.
So that, we don't know that yet. The Winnipeg Foundation's fiscal year end is September 30th. And it's at that point that the Winnipeg Foundation can determine its spending policy. That spending policy is based on a formula. The good news is the spending policy can never drop by more than 0.2% a year. So the lowest it will be 4.8%. But unfortunately, we don't know exactly what that number is, but I would estimate that it'll be consistent with our responsive grant making budget from 2019.
Okay, a question around estimates that are required for community grants. Do you need to submit 2 estimates?
Yes, certainly 2 estimates are preferred for capital renovation projects as well as equipment purchases. And that's partly to protect you. Over the years, I have seen estimates come in wildly different for very similar projects. But we do know that there might be circumstances where there's only one supplier of that product or service, and in that case, we would accept 1 quote, or you might have an established relationship with a particular service provider. For example, if there's one company that does all of your IT, it might only make sense to get a quote from that organization. So in some circumstances, we would also just accept one quote.
Okay, there are a few questions here around collaboration. One about, can you apply for both a collaborative grant and a standalone application? And then a couple of questions about what would be considered a collaborative partner for an application.
Yes, so absolutely, you can apply for your organization's own project as well as a collaborative project in the same calendar year or even in the same intake. And the idea is we love collaborations. They're often great ways to move something forward in community. And so we don't want an organization to have to take on the application for that project and limit their own opportunities to apply. In terms of who is an eligible collaborative partner, so again, if you're a registered charity, a collaborative partner could be 1 or more other registered charities, or it could be an incorporated nonprofit.
Okay, there's a question around recovery from COVID-19 and whether recovery type projects would fall under this granting intake.
Yes, absolutely. That if your organization has an eye to the future and to recovery, those are the types of projects we would certainly accept through this intake for one-time community grants, while acknowledging that some organizations aren't there yet, that they're still kind of working their way through the impacts of the pandemic.
Okay, there's a couple of questions here around partial funding. So first, a question around whether we would expect to see a detailed plan in the event that a project is not fully funded.
That's a great question. And I think often my answer to these questions is it depends, but I would say that that's something that our staff would follow up with you on if we felt like that might be a possibility for your project. I think often we say the average grant from the Winnipeg Foundation, although this year will be different, but in a typical year, average community grant would be in the around $20,000 range, and the majority of our grants would be $50,000 or less. So if your total request was somewhere in that ballpark, we wouldn't require kind of a detailed breakdown of what you would do with less funding. But again, our staff would always follow up with you if they had that question.
And kind of related to that, should a group apply for the full amount they think they need, or should they apply for a lesser amount, knowing that sometimes our grants committee decides on a partial grant amount?
Yeah, so that's another great question. And that's another one, it's a little bit, it depends. But my first answer is sometimes we might grant less than what you've requested, but we will never grant more than what you've requested. So we'd always encourage you to put forward what you feel you need to successfully complete the project. But in the meantime, encourage you to continue to reach out to other funders. I think if you're a first-time applicant, I would really encourage you not to submit your request in at the higher end of the scale of the maximum available, because in that instance, it would probably be unlikely that the foundation would fully fund your request. So it varies a little bit, but my best advice is to always put forward a request that outlines what you need to successfully complete the project.
Okay, there's a question here about what we consider calendar year versus fiscal year. So I know that we've used both of those kind of scales when talking about applications in a calendar year and then budgeting is kind of in a fiscal year. Can you just review how we talk about the calendar?
Yeah, that's great. So when we talk about the calendar year for how often you can apply for grants to the Winnipeg Foundation, we consider just a typical calendar year, January 1st to December 31st. It's just, we know that all of you have different year ends, so it's easiest to keep track of if it's simply the calendar year. But for the purposes of calculating our budgets, we do rely on our fiscal year, which ends at the end of this month.
Okay, great. A question around the timeline for notification of grant approval and whether a project can start before that notification is received.
Yeah, so we try to notify organizations shortly after the grants committee meets. Again, likely at the end of January, beginning of February this year. You could certainly start a project before notification, but again, note that the Winnipeg Foundation wouldn't cover any costs that you incurred prior to the grants committee date. So if you did start a program sooner, the foundation wouldn't cover any of those costs. And I think it's also important to, part of the reason that we have that guideline is because funding isn't guaranteed. And so we would hate to see someone start a project hoping for funding and then for whatever reason, the foundation not be able to fulfill their request.
Okay, getting back to that idea of COVID recovery, there's a question here about whether we would consider costs for overhead and administration going forward.
Yeah, so I think we would consider that kind of short-term or bridge operating support, which is an eligible cost through our one-time community grants. Unfortunately, community grants is forward-looking, so we won't be able to cover any kind of losses you've incurred prior to now. But if you anticipate that some short-term operating support would help your organization from January and beyond, that would certainly be an eligible grant request.
Okay, can a group submit 2 different applications within this intake?
No, so organizations can only submit 1 application per intake, so only 1 application for September 30th. The one exception is if you are submitting your own project as well as a collaboration.
Okay, great. Well, I think we're up to date on questions that came in through the chat.
Okay.
See anything else here?
Oh, and I see that Joanna has posted links for those of you who are looking at the group chat. Joanna has posted links to our staff contact page, as well as a link to sign up for our grants e-news if you haven't signed up already. So if that's all the questions, again, our Winnipeg Foundation staff are available to answer any more questions or questions that are expressly unique to your organization. I'm going to pause here. So everybody who has used our online grant application already, thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. I really miss seeing everybody in person when we run these sessions, but thanks for joining us. And for those who would like a little bit more detail about how to prepare and submit your application, feel free to hang out on the call and we'll walk you through a few slides about that. All right, so this is where I'm going to talk about preparing and submitting your application. So this part is really specific to the one-time community grant application. So first of all, we'd really encourage you, if you're a first-time applicant to the Winnipeg Foundation, or if you haven't applied in a while, to review the policies and guidelines on our website. I've gone over a number of them today, but it's important to review those policies and guidelines just to make sure you understand what is and isn't eligible. And if you're unsure if your project is a fit or if you're eligible, you can always, again, contact a member of our grants team. In the next few slides, we'll be highlighting a couple of areas where our grant application has changed, but you guys mostly are new. So, okay, we're gonna go to the next slide and we're gonna talk about how to apply online. Okay, so the first thing that you're gonna need to do when you want to apply online is set up an account. So our online application, when you set up an account, it asks you for an email address, and that's what becomes the username for your online application account. And so we really encourage people to use a general email address for your organization. So for example, if I was applying, I would use the grants@winnipegfoundation.org email address to set up our account, rather than the Megan Tate email address. If I move on to another organization, it'll be harder for people to access the account. So we really encourage you to use a general email address wherever possible. For those of you who already do have an account, you'll be asked to enter your password. If it's been a while and you've forgotten your password, there is a little button to click that says forgot password, and you'll be asked to enter the email address that was used to establish the account, and a new temporary password will be sent to you. One of the most common questions we get at the foundation is, what's my password? And unfortunately, we don't have access to that information, that is stored within the system. So, but do know that there's a forgot password button that you can click. One great feature of our online application is that you can save your application and come back to it later. You don't have to finish the application all in one sitting. So there is a save and finish later button that's right in the application. When you want to access your in-progress application, don't go back to our homepage and click apply now. That will start a brand new application. Instead, what you want to do is find the button on our grants page that says go to your account. And that's where you will log in, again, your email address and your password, and you'll be able to find the saved in progress application that you started earlier. When you click Save and Finish Later, you will receive an automatically generated email saying that your application has been saved. It's really important to note that your application has been saved. It has not been submitted, and we don't receive it on our end until it has actually been submitted. So that's an important distinction. We've had a few people who saved it thinking that they've submitted it, and so we want you to avoid that disappointment. There is also a feature that allows you to email a draft of your application to yourself or to another colleague who you might want to have them review a draft. So that's another feature of our online system. And finally, to log on to a new application, you'll need to know your organization's registered charity number. That needs to be entered before you can move any further into the online application form. So on the next slide, we're going to talk about some of the information that we look for in the grant application. So first, we want to know a little bit about your organization. We want to know what your annual expense budget is. We're looking for a brief description of your organization, just an overview of what your organization is all about, what services you provide, and to whom. It just really helps us as staff and helps our grants committee put your project into kind of context if we know a little bit more about your organization. You know, many organizations apply to us, you know, each year, and you think, oh, they probably have this information on file, but just it's really important to keep that information as up to date as possible because things might change at your organization, as well as we have changeover in our staff or in our grants committee. And finally, we want you to include the contact details for your highest ranking staff members. So that might be your executive director or your CEO. If your organization has no paid staff, then that would be your board chair, would be the highest ranking staff person. And this is important to note. The person listed here must know that their contact details are included in the application because this is the person that we will contact with the grant decision after the review period. So our practice is always to send any notifications about grant decisions to the highest ranking staff member at an organization. So they certainly need to know that they've been listed in the application and to know to expect that correspondence once the grants committee has met. So a little bit about the request information. So we're also going to be looking for a project contact. And so this is the person who will be most knowledgeable about the project itself. This is the person that our staff will contact if we've got any questions. From time to time, we know that organizations might work with a consultant who will help them with the application process. If you're working with a consultant to prepare your application, you still must list a staff or board member as the project contact. That our relationship really is with the charitable organization. Our relationship is not with a consultant who might be supporting you in that work. And so we're always going to reach out to representatives of the organization if we have any questions. So again, even if it's a consultant who's preparing the application, that the project contact should be a staff or board member. We also want to know how much you're requesting from the Winnipeg Foundation. Please make sure that what you put in the application form matches what you've listed as the amount requested from the foundation in your project budget. The maximum request for a one-time community grant is $100,000. However, the majority of our one-time community grants are usually $50,000 or less. And finally, we're looking for a project summary. So really put a little bit of thought into this project summary, make sure it accurately reflects your project plans. We provide our grants committee or our board with a summary sheet of all applications. So this will be their introduction to the project. From time to time, we also do share this summary sheet with donors who might be interested in supporting a project. So really make this project summary count. All right, on the next slide, a few more things that we look for as part of the grant request. We're looking for the anticipated project start and end date. Again, as I've mentioned, please note that the foundation won't fund projects retroactively, so make sure your start date is after the date of the grants committee decision. So for this intake, probably a safe start date would be February, knowing that the grants committee will be meeting likely at the end of January or at the very, very beginning of February. We also want you to select the cause that best describes your project. So again, we've got those 5 causes. It's an art, not a science, so there might be multiple causes that best describe your project. And so just select the one that you feel best describes your project. And finally, select the project type that best describes your project. So there's a drop-down menu that includes things like, again, capital renovations, equipment, events, that kind of thing. So select the option that best fits your project. And it's important to note that this is more just for our own tracking purposes. It's not like we have separate budgets set aside for each cause or for each project type. So there's no advantage to selecting one cause or project type over another. It really is just to help us kind of have a sense of where our application goes. All right. So in the application, we've got a number of questions. So the first question is to describe your project. And this is where you're going to include more detail. You've already provided a project summary, but this question allows you to go into more detail and tell us what it is that you're planning to do with your project. The second question is asking you to describe how your project fits with our grant-making priorities. Again, as I mentioned, we've got 16 distinct grant-making priorities as well as 2 overriding grant-making priorities. We really recommend that you select 1 or 2 grant-making priorities that your project is going to meet really well. Again, there's no advantage to saying that you align with all 16 grant-making priorities, that we really want you to focus on the 1 or 2 that matches your project best and really speak to the strength of your project and how it aligns with those priorities. It's also important to note that your project may fit a bit of a different priority than what your organization does as a whole. And I think the best example I could give is you might be an organization that serves children and youth, but you're applying to the Winnipeg Foundation to do some environmental retrofits to your space. So even though you're a children and youth serving organization, your project is going to fall under the cause of environment, and you're going to align with the grant making priority that talks about greening the sector. All right, question 3. We want to know how you're going to implement your project. We want to know a little bit about who the project serves, the specific activities that you're planning to undertake, as well as some timelines. In this question, point form might be an appropriate way to answer this question. Number 4, we're looking for you to cite evidence of need of your project and how it'll strengthen your organization and or your community. The evidence of need could be anecdotal. You could share some survey results, research that you've done, observations, statistics, but again, really speaking to why you think that project is needed. Finally, question 5, we want to know about the involvement of your community and other organizations in the development and the implementation of the project. So tell us who's involved, what their role is. This question won't apply to every project. If you are planning a kitchen renovation, you might not have consulted with other organizations for that project, but for any time that it is relevant, this is some information you can include. And finally, what are the goals or the outcomes that you're hoping from this project, and how are you going to evaluate them? And it's important to be as clear here, but also realistic, because this is how we're going to evaluate your project if you receive funding. This is, when we get your final report, we'll look back at that original proposal. And finally, we're looking for sources of financial support for ongoing operating costs of your project. It's helpful to be as specific as possible. Identify other funders if applicable. So perhaps it's a pilot project to address family violence, and you're anticipating that after the pilot, the family violence prevention branch will pick up the costs of running that program. It'd be helpful to include that information. And so again, being as specific as possible instead of just saying province of Manitoba, that if there's a particular department within the government that you anticipate will support ongoing costs, you can include that information. Sometimes there's not ongoing operating costs, and that's okay too. Just note that in that section. In terms of required attachments, we're looking for a project budget, a current list of your board of directors. We want your most recent audited financial statements. Some organizations, depending on your size, you might not have audited financial statements. We also accept a review engagement or a notice to reader. If you don't have any of these financial statements, either because your organization has a very small operating budget or because you're in your first year of operation, just connect with a member of our staff and we can kind of walk you through what the process is for requirements are for financial statements. One of the features of our online application is if you don't have all the required attachments attached, it will not allow you to submit your application. So again, if you do not have audited statements, a review engagement, or a notice to reader, please contact our staff and we can walk you through that. As well, if you don't have an annual report, you can simply attach the minutes from your last annual general meeting. We know that this year the province of Manitoba has extended the timelines for when nonprofit organizations are required to host their annual general meetings. So we recognize some of those minutes might be fairly old. Just attach whatever the most recent ones that you are or that you have, and if at some point during the grant review process you host your annual general meeting, you can always email those and we can add them to your grant file over the course of the review period. And finally, we're looking for an income and expense budget for the your current fiscal year. Some other attachments where applicable, I've already talked about quotes for renovations or capital purchases, letters from collaborative partners if you are intending to submit a collaborative application. If you are a school applying for a grant, we do require a letter from the school division indicating that they are aware of and sign off on the application going forward. Other optional attachments might be a cover letter, just gives you an opportunity to kind of introduce the project outside of the framework of our grant application form, letters of support where applicable. These are they can speak to the evidence of need as well as community involvement in your project. Please choose no more than 5 letters of support that represent a range of stakeholder. We get a lot of applications every year, and so we wouldn't have an opportunity to read through many attachments or many letters. Another thing that we often see is fairly generic letters from your city councilor or your MLA. Unless it's a really specific letter talking about your project, those letters don't typically strengthen a proposal like letters from community partners or community members might. Finally, please don't send any other materials such as books or videos or CDs. We just can't accommodate those kinds of extra materials. And we also can't accept web links to Dropbox or other document sharing programs just for security reasons. So what you're looking at on the screen is our project budget template. This is the top half of it, and this is where we ask you to list all of your revenues. Including, you'll see at the top, the Winnipeg Foundation current grant request. We've got headings for different types of grants that you might receive or different types of funding. Again, please be as specific as possible. So under government grants, if it's a particular department within the federal, municipal, or provincial government, it's helpful for us to have that information. As well as other grants. So if you're an arts organization, if you have funding from Canada Council, MAC, or WAC, we like to know that. If you've gotten funding from other foundations, like a family foundation, please be as specific as possible. You will note that there is kind of in the middle of your screen a little column with some checkboxes. That is where you can click if the funding has been confirmed. So if the funding is confirmed, click that box. If it's still pending, you can just leave that box blank. That just lets us know kind of where you're at with your fundraising for that project. One thing to note is in-kind revenue must offset in-kind expenses. So you need to put a value around that. So if you want to show that you're getting in-kind support from your local grocery store, for example, they're going to be providing free hot dogs for the event that you're hosting. You can list that in kind in that section in kind. So let's say $100 worth of hot dogs, but you need to make sure that that is also reflected on the expense side, so that somewhere on your budget, you would have a food expense of $100 that balances off that in-kind support. And the final thing to note is that there is a revised column and a final report actuals column. The revised budget you can fill out if, for example, you don't receive the full amount you requested, you can revise the budget. And then the final column is what you'd fill out as part of your final report. The bottom half of the budget template is your expenses. Again, try to be as specific as possible. And the expense side of your budget and your application should really make sense and align with your project description. So there shouldn't be anything in the expense side of your budget that doesn't make sense. So again, you're running a youth program. You've described that you're going to be having after school activities run by 3 staff, that we would expect to see staff, program costs, that kind of thing in the expense side of your budget. The form does automatically add for you, and you need to make sure your expenses and revenues balance. Okay. Probably, if you can see me leaning in. So uploading attachments. This is something that can hang people up if it's their first time using our online application. So uploading, what you can see there is actually a screenshot of our online application system. And what we've highlighted is there's a drop-down menu where you can select the type of attachment that you are attaching. So in this instance, we've clicked most recent audited financial statements. So you click that, and then I'm going to ask Noah to go to the next screen to show what it looks like. So now you'll see in the title, most recent audited financial statements. Then you will click the browse button, which will take you to your computer. And so you'll find where the audited financial statements are saved on your computer. And you'll click upload, and that will attach that document to the online application form. And so you'll have to do that for each of the documents that we're looking for. And then you can see here, that's what it looks like. Most recent audited financial statements, file name, and that's how you'll know that you have successfully attached the document. And you, as I mentioned, you won't be permitted to submit your application until you've uploaded each of the required documents. Finally, when your application is finished, you've got everything the way that you want it to be, it's really important to hit the review and submit button. This is going to give you one more chance to review your application, and it will highlight any information that might be missing or incomplete. Once you have completed all the information, it'll ask you one more time if you want to save and finish later or submit. And you're going to want to submit because that's how we get it on our end. So when your application is complete, once you've updated all the required fields, you'll be given the option to submit. When you do submit, you will get an automatic email confirmation. Please save this email confirmation for your records. As we know, technology doesn't always work exactly how it is, and so that will be your confirmation that you have successfully submitted your application to the Winnipeg Foundation. A few weeks after the intake deadline, you'll also receive an email from a live member of our grant staff officially confirming your application and providing you with a grant number. At that time, we will also be able to provide you hopefully with the specific date of the grants committee meeting. Just some really general tips about submitting a grant application. Please be as concise and clear as you can be. Try to avoid jargon and acronyms. So we know that in every field, there's specific words or acronyms that you use that we might not be familiar with. So try to avoid that. If you're using an acronym, always spell it out the first time, and then you can continue to use the acronym through the rest of the document. Make sure to proofread your application or ask someone else to proofread it for you. We've had many organizations tell us that they prepare their application in a Word document first. This allows them to kind of craft their response, and then they can simply cut and paste it into the application form. And that's a good idea in case you get interrupted while completing your application, or if your computer glitches, that kind of thing. One thing to note is that any formatting like bullets will be lost when you paste it into our system, but that is a tip we've heard from other organizations. All right, I think we're in the home stretch now. A note about deadlines. So the application portal does close promptly at 4:30. Depending on the age of your computer, the speed of your connection, it can take a few minutes for your application to be fully transferred after you complete submit. So please don't wait till 4:30 or even 4:29. You know, the sooner you can hit submit, the easier your mind will be. And also, if you do run into any issues, our staff will be able to support you, but we won't be able to help you after the portal has closed. Yeah. So finally, a little bit about the review process. Once we get all the applications, a grants associate will be assigned to your file. If they have any questions or need additional information, they'll always follow up with you before it goes to our grants committee, who reviews and makes the final decisions about the one-time community grants. And then finally, a little bit about after a grant decision has been made. So if you are successful, you will receive a terms of grant agreement, and that includes information confirming the amount and the purpose of the grant, as well as any other terms that go along with it. Something that it's important to note, if your organization engages with a fundraiser, either as a staff person or a consultant, it's important to know that they must adhere to the Association of Fundraising Professionals Code of Ethical Standards. And that statement has now been built into our terms of grant agreement. In particular, what we're looking for is information around compensation for fund development staff. AFP does have some guidelines around what is and is not ethical in terms of compensation for fundraising staff, and that's why we've added that to our agreement. If a donor has contributed to the grant that you received, you may be asked to provide a letter of thanks that we can pass along to that donor. That information would also be included in your terms of grant agreement package. We pay all of our grants by automatic deposit. So if we don't have your direct deposit information on file, there'll be a form to fill out around that. A report will always be due after your project is completed, but we just invite you to stay in touch with us. You know, we know that best laid plans don't always work out. And so if there is a change to your project, we would just ask you to touch base with our staff to let us know that we understand that these things happen, but it just helps if we know in real time as opposed to after the fact. And finally, if you are unsuccessful with your grant application, you can certainly follow up with us, and we're happy to give you some feedback on the grants committee's decision. So that's the more technical aspect of applying for a grant. And so maybe we'll do the same thing that we had done before. And if anybody's got some questions, they can post them in the chat feature, and hopefully Carrie can read those out to me.
We've been answering questions as they've appeared in the chat box. So I think they're pretty much up to date.
Okay. That sounds good. All right.
Yeah, I'm not seeing anything new in the last few minutes.
Okay. Well, thanks everybody for hanging out on the end of this call. It's a lot of detail to get through. And again, as I've mentioned throughout the presentation, if you do, once you've started your application, if you run into any more questions, feel free to reach out to a member of our staff. So thank you all, and have a good rest of your afternoon.